whether it causes stress or not is dependent on your experience. It's dependent on your education. It's also dependent on things like, how tired are you? How well have you eaten? Have you moved your body? Have you had enough water? Right?
Yeah. Too often, our minds go from 0 to 60 and uses a lot of assumptions and shortcuts to reach to a conclusion, right? So you want to take a look at the evidence of your interpretation.
One day, the things that send you sailing and flying off into deep emotional hijack will be just bumps in the road or just smooth sailing, honestly. So, Dinesh, many of us have found ourselves working really, really hard to achieve the success we've achieved. And the thought that kind of runs in the back of our mind is that we don't have a choice, and we have to compromise our sleep or compromise time with our families or compromise our time with our self-care in whatever way that looks like in order to achieve and maintain that success.
I think that, like everything we've talked about, there's a spectrum. I think long-term, losing sight of the fact that, it's a marathon as opposed to a sprint can often lead to less success than if you kept in mind the sustainability aspect of it. Right?
Yeah, but nobody's thinking about the sustainability in the moment, right? They're just thinking, I've got to get this done.
Right. They are thinking they've got to get this done. But there is a lot of truth to short bursts of compressed obsessive type behavior where you're really focused on it, right?
Right.
And so, you think about like medical school, like residency chucks full a ton of learning that becomes effective as opposed to spacing that out for a long time, right? It's the same thing of like working out. If I did 1 rep every other day, it's less effective than I did if I did 12 within 5 minutes or something like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's nuanced. I think just based on my experience, medical school, dental school, like it's in very many ways highly inefficient. And because it's prolonged, it actually is, it's a chronic form of stress. I don't know that we're all operating at our best in that situation. But I think too, there's a component. So there's 2 components. One is this belief that unless you earned it by bleeding and screaming and kicking and crying, like, did you even earn it? That's, I don't know that that's for everybody, but I know I've experienced that from many people in my life is sort of this inability to buy into, I am worthy, I am capable, and I did earn it, even though I didn't kill myself in the process. And then there's the other side of it where we've just sort of sold ourselves the idea that we didn't have a choice, and we fall into this trap, and then we don't know how to work our way out of it, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But I think you mentioned something that was really quite important in that stress isn't all bad.
I'd actually say that stress is neutral. Right?
Say more about that. Yeah.
I mean, the thing that some people interpret by stress may not be stress for someone else.
Sure. Yeah.
Right? So someone might have fear of public speaking. And that might put them under a lot of stress. But that may not be stressor for somebody else, right? And so I think stress, the activity that causes someone stress, if you peel it back, in my opinion, is actually neutral. And it's our perception of that is what causes a stress or causes growth.
Right. So, I mean, for example, if you had a patient who was dying and you've never taken care of a patient who's dying, that's really stressful. But if, you're like some of our listeners who deal with death every single day, they know exactly what to do. There's protocols, there's procedures, they're trained. They know every possible thing that could go wrong and are prepared to handle any drift from that set of procedures and occurrences. I think you're so right. It isn't, what I'm saying that is the stimulus is neutral. I think you're saying the same thing. Whether it causes stress or not is dependent on your experience. It's dependent on your education. It's also dependent on things like, how tired are you?
Yeah.
How well have you eaten? Have you moved your body? Have you had enough water? Right?
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. How tired you are, how hungry you are, whether you're feeling well, whether you've slept well, right? I mean, one of my favorite quotes you've heard me say on this, the shortest line from despair to hope is a good night's rest, right?
Yeah.
And the stimulus, like you said, that's a great word. Uh, it is only, you know, stressful in sort of a subjective way, and a lot of us could feel that, and it could feel like a consensus, right? Could feel
Hmm.
like a fact. But I think, we're both parents, and the first kid you have elicits levels of stress
Right.
that you don't feel with the second kid, right? I mean,
Right.
first kid, um, I remember with Jayan when he got like a scratch or something on his leg. I likened it to getting a dent on your new car. I was like, his exterior shell is perfect, his skin was perfect,
Yeah.
and now we got a dent on it. And just the other day, I got an email from Sanvi's school that said she bumped her head. She okay? And
Mm.
you know, as a more experienced parent now, that
Yeah.
same factual scenario didn't cause as much stress.
Right. Right. So true. There's tons of, I think, parenting stories that are just like popping through my head about remember when, and
Yeah.
now I can have a good laugh about it. But the stress in and of itself, I think we've created this market where we want to bust stress, we want to avoid stress. We've told ourselves that stress is bad, um, and I think what you and I wanted to kind of share with our listeners today was that that's not always the case. Stress
Yeah.
can be a great initiator or catalyst for
Hmm.
some meaningful and purposeful growth.
Yeah.
Um, and it can unlock our deepest potential, but it really just depends on the type of stress we experience, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. Do you know that story or quote? I can't remember, and I'm tempted to look it up, but it's something about a tree and it's stronger when it's like growing in winds or a storm. What is that? Do you know
Hmm.
what that is?
So there was a study out there.
Yeah.
I don't know the quote. There, I'm sure there's like an eloquent meme or something with a quote, but there was really a study where I think they constructed a bubble out in New Mexico or Arizona or something,
Yeah.
and they planted a bunch of trees that basically were protected from the wind,
Hmm.
and they grew and grew and grew, and then when they deconstructed the dome and left the trees,
Yeah.
they all fell because they didn't have the root system developed that was developed in response to the stress of having the wind blow through them and needing to grip the ground to create that solid foundation.
Yes, yes. And the quote is strong winds, strong roots,
Ah,
right?
yes. I
Yeah,
knew there
and
was like a really pretty, elegant way of saying that. I just couldn't remember.
yeah, there is strong winds, strong roots. I love it. Maybe that's the title of this episode. Um,
Yeah.
so our amazing assistant that helps us bring this podcast to you every week. Her name is Shannon, so shout out to Shannon. Shannon, we got our title: Strong Winds, Strong Roots. Anyways, back to our episode, um, and the substance that we're trying to share. So yeah, I think that um, there is a I don't want to say affection, but an inclination to take the path of least resistance,
Hmm.
to to choose easy every time.
Hmm.
And I think there is a downside to removing all of the strong winds in your life. I think
Yeah.
that without the strong winds, without certain stressors, or even if you try to alleviate them for other people, you may be robbing someone of an opportunity of growth, as
Hmm.
frankly, Philip said on our last episode, right? Like you don't
Yeah.
want to rob someone of their bottom.
Yeah. No, he said it so eloquently. I heard something very similar on Dr. Sheila Akbar's podcast, and we're hosting her very soon too. But they talked about the same thing: the importance of actually requiring some use stress, as they
Hmm.
call it. Adam Grant mentions use stress in his book Hidden Potential, um, and use stress essentially, for those of you who don't know, that's the good kind of stress, the
Yeah.
kind that it might throw you off your game a little bit temporarily, but it really helps you look inward and find inspiration, find motivation, find outside of the box thinking, collaboration. It kind of facilitates an environment where you get to be innovative.
Yeah.
And it is the result of some really incredible things.
Right. Yeah. Eustress basically energizes, motivates us. But what's important, I think, is that you have eustress when you interpret the stimulus in a beneficial way, right? And
Right.
it's moderate and it's normal, fair amounts of psychological stress, fair amounts of physical stress, fair amounts of mental stress.
Mm-hmm.
A crossword puzzle, right,
Yeah.
is eustress, or physical therapy after an accident or surgery or something, even though it hurts, even though your muscles are tight or whatever it is, that kind of eustress pushes you to actually develop and grow past your current limitations. And without that eustress, it's kind of, there's no growth. And when there's no growth, there is more likely than not shrinkage. Very,
Yeah.
very rarely do things stay stagnant and stasis. I mean, things, in at least my experience on the planet Earth, tend to gravitate towards um, entropy. So it's either moving
Mm-hmm.
one way or another as opposed to staying stable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And even within homeostasis within our own bodies, right? There's a range. It's not like you're perfectly at 98, point whatever degrees all the time. You run a little hot, you run a little cold. Your sugars go up, your sugars go down, but they're within a range.
Yeah.
And so I to I think the best example of this is like when you land a big client, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you have your systems in place and you're nervous because maybe this is like your dream client, or it's a really big contract or something. Your body's excited.
Mm-hmm.
And it does, the body can't tell the difference between fear and excitement.
Mm-hmm.
There's a very similar chemical cocktail, if you will, that's happening. And so the eustress is, to your point, it energizes. It's exciting to have landed a nice, big, shiny new contract that you get to, really serve your purpose in and affect change and all of those things.
Mm-hmm.
Distress, on the other hand, actually saps us of our potential, saps us of our bandwidth, and does the opposite, right? So that's where I feel like most people tend to get stuck in overwhelm or avoidance or this like need to control how everything goes.
Yeah.
I mean, I know I do.
Mm-hmm.
Even though I'm a happy human, I still get distressed.
Yeah. But are we going to go as far as saying that the thing isn't stressing you out? You're creating the stress that's stressing you out?
I believe it's so perceptive, right? I mean, and again, like you can always, everything we say on the show is so nuanced, it's contextual.
Right.
So when you say something like a cancer diagnosis, for example,
Mm-hmm.
of course that's going to be distressful, right? And there's like, there's no need to judge that as, are you wrong or incapable of handling whatever's in front of you simply because you're experiencing distress? No. But I think your perception does matter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think perception does matter, oftentimes, but maybe let's see if we can identify some more commonplace scenarios that our listeners likely encounter on a day-to-day basis,
Sure.
where we can draw this distinction between distress or eustress and try to see how much of that is in our control. Yeah, do you have any examples?
I mean, I recently was talking about this very topic, and what I told people was, so distress, for example, is a health concern or a toxic work environment, an unhealthy marriage, conditional happiness, versus eustress is landing a client or getting engaged, or I have a friend who just literally decided to put together a conference, and she gave herself 10 weeks, and she did it. Right.
Wow.
And it was inspiring and amazing. And we were all so great and grateful to be able to support her. But what I was telling this group was all of those things, whether it's a source of stress, distress, or eustress, really just depends on where you're at in your mindset journey. So I think it's a little bit harder for me to categorically, definitively say this is an example of distress versus eustress, because if that's your norm, then maybe you know how to handle it, right? Like changing a diaper for a lot of my brothers and sisters-in-laws, but when they didn't have kids, was distress.
Yeah.
And, it's not now because they're on their like second or third kid.
Right. So it's all about the lens that we look at it through, right?
Right. Yeah.
So if someone is feeling that something is stressing them out, what how can they do we have the power to go from distress to eustress?
I think so.
Like, what are some ways we can do that?
Well, I think first of all, I can only say what's worked for me, and what how I help people through it is just stopping and recognizing that we're experiencing distress, right? Like that's okay.
Awareness.
Yeah, awareness, like without judgment of the fact that you're feeling stressed. A good example of this is like when I get frustrated and I snap at my kids, right? I will, in full transparency, there are moments where I judge myself for snapping at my kids, because I tell myself this story of like, you authored this book on navigating emotion, and you have the Happy and Human podcast, and you're this, success coach that talks about this. This is exactly what you help your clients with. One of the things you help your clients with, and yet here you are snapping at your kids.
Yeah.
But the reality of it is, it's my emotions in that moment. They were valid. They were true. I was maybe tired, maybe stressed. Maybe I was just feeling the energy of them having a hard day. And for whatever reason, I wasn't able to hold space and compassion for them in the way that I normally would. Right. So and what I've started to do is tell the kids, like, I need a time in ticket. Or I've told Manish, like, for those of you who have listened
what is that?
to
What is that? Time to
time
go buy
ticket.
a ticket? A
time
ticket to
in
where?
ticket.
Time in ticket where?
Time in ticket to yourself.
Oh, time in. Oh, I thought you said a time and ticket. I'm like, where's the ticket taking you?
No. The ticket is taking you to a place of peace. We call it a time in ticket. I'm pretty sure I stole that phrase from Tejal Patel. Okay. Like I'm like 99% sure that I stole that phrase from her, borrowed, whatever. But it is an invitation to just recognize, like, I have a need that's not being met, and I'm feeling stress. I'm feeling anger. I'm feeling anxiety, nervousness, whatever it is. And just stopping to recognize that that's where I'm at is hugely, hugely beneficial, because oftentimes your intuition will take over and say things like, oh, okay, maybe you want to leave the room. Maybe you want to not answer that email. Maybe you want to just take a walk. Or sometimes it's as simple as I need to go to the bathroom or take a sip of water. Right? That's at least for me, that's what's been really effective, is just the awareness.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think a couple of other tactics or strategies that might be useful is, there's this concept of positive reframing, right? Like looking at the negative and finding the silver lining, or finding the seed of growth or something in there, right? And you've talked about this, looking for being grateful for the thing that's that brings you the challenge, right? So if someone is going through a difficult time with their kid going off to college or something, right?
Yeah.
You could focus on the gratitude of the time you did have together, or the wonderful life that will be ahead of them because of this challenge that has now presented itself. And the other tactic that I've seen and used quite frequently is really examining all of the evidence, right? Too often our minds go from 0 to 60 and uses a lot of assumptions and shortcuts to reach to a conclusion, right? So you want to take a look at the evidence of your interpretation of a scenario, right? So
Right.
I'm just thinking out loud, just making stuff up. Let's say my kid came home and said, "Dad, I want to get a tattoo,"
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Um, I could see scenarios where people just lose their mind, right? Like,
Sure.
that's absolutely not happening. You live under my house, all of that stuff. Um, but really examining the evidence and saying, okay, well, and it's a principle of 5 whys, right? Well,
Yeah.
why is it bad to get a tattoo?
Hmm.
And usually what we're thinking is like this projection, like this tattoo leads to something else, leads to something else, leads to
Yeah.
something else. And oh my God, it's going to be over. And we're thinking in terms of extreme language, right?
Right.
Like it's always going to be this way, or it's never going to get better, or um, we have all these assumptions or biases baked in. So anyways, to bring it back, that's a long-winded way of saying that the two most common uh, strategies is the positive reframing, finding gratitude, and then examining the evidence and questioning that, you know, that your thoughts aren't the facts, and
Yeah.
what are the facts here,
Yeah. And
right? Oh, I want to go back. Wait, I want to go back. I want to go back to when you said that you judge yourself for snapping, right? And I think you
Mhm.
said that you have a podcast, you're a coach, and I think I have a really helpful metaphor for you. You want me to share it?
Sure.
So the person that repairs a Ferrari does not need to own a Ferrari,
Right.
right? And so just because like you can fix Ferraris doesn't mean you drive one, or just because you drive one doesn't mean you can fix one, right?
Right.
So
Right.
I think that's the benefit of some of the coaching work that you do.
Well, and I think importantly, having that awareness is what allows me to have empathy and compassion for when my clients are struggling, because I know exactly what it's like for me in situations similar, right? So
Absolutely.
it makes you a relatable person. It makes you an authentic and vulnerable person.
Yeah.
No one is perfect. Everyone has some sense of self-judgment, and that's the work, right?
Hmm.
So kind of going back, I really love what you said about the positive reframing. In every situation or circumstance, there's an opportunity or a gift, as we talked about in our episode with the stallion story. Um,
Yeah.
and gratitude is taking that one step further, as well as asking the whys and stopping ourselves from catastrophizing. And I will say that in order to do either of those two things, the recognition that you are stressed is really step one. You
Yeah.
have to recognize that you're in a place that may not be serving you best.
Hmm.
You are in a state of distress. Sometimes all you can do is acknowledge, and other times you can move forward and say, all right, well, what can I look at differently? How can I see this differently? But the self-awareness is kind of, to me, the foundation. And these two tactics, I love that you shared them because they're tangible and they're actionable. You can do this literally anywhere, anytime. And usually you can talk yourself back from jumping off the ledge,
Right. Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The first way you appraise the situation won't be the way you reappraise the situation, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
And I think, like you said, riding the wave of whatever emotions are coming up, or stress or difficulty that you're feeling, just letting that pass,
Hmm.
getting a good night's rest, giving yourself some space instead of catastrophizing what may or may not come to bear, right?
Hmm.
is
Yeah.
is um is really really interesting. And this is a little bit of a tangent, but you know people talk about manifesting. Gabby Bernstein talks about manifesting
Hmm.
in the coaching world. People talk a lot about manifesting, but I think I can represent fairly accurately that manifesting for most people seems a little woo woo. And at least before I got into this world, was kind of like sitting there and envisioning something, and just hoping for it, right?
Right.
But the reality is, a lot of high performers, when we are feeling stress, we're worrying. And
Hmm.
you know what worrying is? Worrying is imagining a bad outcome that hasn't
Right.
happened yet,
Right.
right? And that is the same as manifesting. So we're all manifesting, we're all thinking about it. We get to choose um, you know, what interpretation we apply, and that I think could make a difference between operating under stress or operating under a bit more calm and ease.
100%. And the one other tip, as I was listening to you talk about manifestation and stuff, was contextualization, right?
Mhm.
So this actually happened. We had our house cleaned. We have someone come to help us. She normally has a person with her to come. She was just by herself, and so it took her like the whole day to clean the
Yeah.
house. And then I walked into the kids' bathroom and there's water all over the floor after she had just spent like 8 hours cleaning our house by herself. And I just, immediately in that day felt like, what the heck? Like there was judgment of the situation, judgment of, whichever kid left, quote unquote, the mess.
Mhm.
There was a lot of assumptions happening. And, when you take the time to think to yourself, okay, is this going to matter in 5 minutes? Is this going to matter in 5 months? Is
Mhm.
this going to matter in 5 years? Right?
Yeah.
Like it really helps you get perspective and then manifest accordingly, right? Like, okay, well, if it's not going to matter in 5 months, is there a way I can make it not matter in 5 minutes, right? Like there's all sorts of assumptions going on in my brain about why that water is there.
Right.
Who knows what
Yeah.
happened, right?
Absolutely. But I think that's a tall order to ask of someone that's in limbic hijack when
Absolutely.
you're triggered and you know you're thinking that you're right. You've got to prove you're right. Like this is the way. Like how could it be this way? But I have good news. I think that if you bring the awareness over time, it becomes like second nature. You get a
It
lot better
does.
at it. And one trick that I use pretty often is when I feel myself thinking that I'm right, or
Mhm.
like you said, like how's this water here? Which kid spilled it? Is to ask myself, how could I be wrong about this?
Yeah.
Right. Um, and that just I think there's enough space in there to ask, like, how could I be wrong about this? Frequently reminds me that for by and large, most instances, people are trying to do the right thing or what they think is right in the moment, given their circumstances, given their stressors, given whatever they've got going on, and more often than not, will do the best of their ability at that time. And yeah, that might fall short, it may be totally wrong, but it helps to bring back a fair amount of empathy and compassion and forget the empathy and the compassion part, to be perfectly honest. Like what we're trying to share with you is, yeah, it's great to have empathy and compassion, but you need to retain control of your emotions and your sensitivities and your senses, right? So
Mhm.
that you can continue to think in calm, logical terms as opposed to acting out of emotion.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And to kind of really highlight for the listeners, it is a tall order. I completely agree with you. It's a tall order when this is a new practice.
Mhm.
Honestly, it's a tall order when you've been practicing for years and you're still in limbic hijack because you're human and that will happen.
Mhm.
It's a tall order. And so the key to that is just practicing all of these tools and techniques as often as you can. Um, be willing to be quote unquote wrong. Be willing to examine this and say, all right, how can I slow down? How can I take a time and ticket? How can I um, see if this is going to matter in 5 minutes, 5 months, 5 years? It there are there's a lot of value in practicing these things. You're not going to
Yeah.
get it perfect, and that's why we call it practice.
Right.
And eventually one day the things that send you sailing and flying off into deep emotional hijack will be just bumps in the road or just smooth sailing, honestly. um
Absolutely.
you know
Absolutely. Once you get that awareness and you train yourself to look at it from someone else's or another perspective, I think I think the world changes.
yeah.
It's a total game changer. And I'll go back to something we said earlier. So if you want to rewind, Seema said that. Correct me if I'm wrong. You said there was a woman who came to your house and by herself she cleaned the house for 8 hours, right?
Yeah,
Is that what you said?
something along those lines. Yeah.
Yeah. And so my first thought that just like zinged across my head was like, wow, Seema's got a really big house. I was like, wait, let me test that assumption.
Hmm.
It's really either a really big house or a small house that's really dirty, right?
Hmm.
And you can see how there's two plausible explanations for why it takes 8 hours to clean your house, right?
Maybe she
And
was deep cleaning the house, like wiping the baseboards and dusting the
maybe,
tops of the cabinets, right? Like all sorts
right,
of assumptions.
right, maybe. And yes, there is that assumption that is plausible that maybe she's not a good cleaner, right?
Yeah,
And maybe she's just trying to take Seema's money and is sitting there making TikToks in Seema's house.
right?
But I think for most part, there's four plausible explanations there. We have to choose the one that gives us the most meaning. And um, you know, I don't think it does me any good to think that Seema has a dirty house or that her cleaner is robbing her. So I'm going to choose the interpretation that Seema has a really big house, and when I go to visit Austin, I'll have a place to stay.
You
See
do
how
have a
much better
place
I
to
feel?
stay. So
I'm a
much better.
happy human right now.
We live in Texas, so big and small is really, really skewed as to compared to whether you live in like I don't know New York City. But and to be fair, yeah, there's thoughts that serve, there's thoughts that don't serve. We get to choose, we get to decide what's going to actually ultimately help us feel good, and that when we
Yeah,
feel good, we do good, and when we do good, that just perpetuates a cycle that we actually want to be in.
absolutely.